All right. Well, welcome to the first episode of the way that we're doing things now with Sexplorers. This is a collaboration between Braxton and with Birds and Beasts podcast, and
I'm Cami Hurst with Sex Therapy 101.
And we're really excited to be here because we've been doing this. Cami, how long have we been doing Sexy Book Club for?
Before, maybe 2019.
I think so.
Yeah, because we were doing it in person in Salt Lake, and then COVID hit, and we figured out how to do it.
Yes. Yep.
At distance.
Mm-hmm. So we're excited because we're going to add on to that. Me and Cami have such wonderful chemistry. So we decided let's add from the Sexy Book Club. And with the questions we were getting and the people that were talking to us, we identified a lot of people really need to explore their sexual selves. And because Cami has her doctorate, is it doctorate in sex therapy? What's your doctorate in?
Clinical sexology.
Clinical sexology. Because Cami has a doctorate in clinical sexology, and I'm a certified sex therapist. Cami's a certified sex therapist. We figured we'd explore all these things together, and what better way to do that than being a sexplorer? So there are a lot of fun things to come. We're planning to do this weekly for multiple seasons. We'll get a couple of seasons in a year. So we look forward to having you along. This is something that allows you to be able to respond to us, ask questions live, and even send us questions when we're not live. So anything to add there, Cami?
Yeah, no, if you want to send in some questions, you can do that at sexplorers@gmail.com. And then we're going to be responding to the live chat in YouTube. We've got the setting. We're going to set the settings up so that subscribers of the channel can comment to try to weed out some trolls or inauthentic comments. And so if you want to follow us, please subscribe on our YouTube channel so that then your questions or comments, we'll be able to see them and respond to them in real time. We decided we loved the name Sexplorers for our show. First of all, it wasn't taken. Second of all, that's what we want to do. We want to explore all of the education about sexual health that most of our systems failed us at. Most of our families of origin or our school systems or our religious institutions and just our culture in general have failed us in having an adequate sexual health understanding. And so we're sexplorers together in this podcast. So please join us on Monday mornings. We're going to be doing this at 9 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. So
awesome. Well, I'm going to show the book that we are covering today, which is Magnificent Sex. So we've got Magnificent Sex that actually we really like using the Audible, if we can have Audible a part of this, because we know that not everyone is more into the reading side of things, but this has a physical copy as well as an Audible copy to listen to Magnificent Sex. This is done by Peggy Kleinplatz and Dana Menard. And I'm really excited to start talking about this. Most of all, I mean, to start out with it, Cami, I don't know, did you feel any type of for me, I felt a little bit of maybe a little bit of shame or guilt, not guilt, but shame that came up. There was and then we interviewed sex therapists, and this is what they thought.
Oh yeah, totally. Yes. So the setting of this book is Kleinplatz and Menard did a research study, and that's what this book is about. And so this isn't, these are the ideas we think contribute to magnificent sex. They did a huge qualitative research study and interviewed people who said that they had magnificent sex lives. And they were like, whoa, tell us about it and how you got there and what it's made out of. And some of the people they interviewed, yes, were sex therapists. And yes, there was a little shame when she said, couples said this. It was interesting because we heard a lot of sex therapists say this, and that actually doesn't line up with the people's experience. And it's like, yeah, we got to stay humble about what we think we know. And we've got to always allow the client in our office to be the expert of their experience.
Agreed.
That came through in her research. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wasn't sure. I found myself wanting to know how long ago did they talk with these sex therapists? Were these sex therapist someone that are currently practicing? Was there there was a lot of like statements that almost came across as like, whoa, are we believing that? Are we not? So I'm very I'd be interested to know which sex therapist they interviewed, and how they identified as sex therapists, if they had certifications or not. That was one that was going through my head, because some of the comments I was like, I haven't heard any of the sex therapists that I know that are certified through ASECT. I haven't heard them speaking like that, but
Yeah.
I don't know. Did you find any for yourself?
No, I felt that way too. I was like, oh, that doesn't line up with my training. So it's interesting I know that Peggy Kleinplatz is located in Canada. I don't know if Dana Menard is. Let's see. Yes, she is. So both of these are professors in Canada, where there's much more funding in Canada for sexual research. America, there's usually no grants for sexual research unless it's for a male-oriented medication, pharmacology. But and so I'm not sure how active ASECT is in Canada. So I had that question. I said, if most of these were Canadian identified sex therapists, I know that ASECT is the American Association for Sex Therapy, and that's where both of our training is aligned with that institution as our governing body with ethics and educational standards. I'm not sure about the certification process in Canada, if it's different or not. I'm not sure.
Yeah, very interesting. So those are just a couple of start-off questions. As you're reading the book, that was one thing that I was thinking. It can feel, it's important to know, just like what you said earlier. I think that's like, hey, depends on the person you get. It depends on what's, each person's different. You can't say you meet with one sex therapist and you met with all of them. And I think that that's an important one, is that as you read the book, if it's like, whoa, sex therapists have some pretty intense thought processes. Yes, and I would put a caveat to that. But in reading the book, I guess I get curious, Cami, when you were going through the book, what were some of the things that you'd like to start out on? What is because they broke it down into some really good, what is it, six components to sexual, or that they found from these interviews. And I was thinking maybe we could walk through each of these different key ideas. Does that sound like an okay plan?
Yeah, let's do that. I think that's a great idea.
All right. Well, when we first start out with a certain key idea, the first one was that increasing your sexual desire by having better sex. What are your thoughts on that? Increase your sexual desire by having better sex.
I think that is an underrated main idea that we probably need to shout from the rooftops. My private practice is in Meridian, Idaho, so I get a certain demographic here in the Rocky Mountain West. And for many of my clients, they may have had one or two partners. And so the sex they're being offered is their definition of sex. And they may not realize that them not liking the sex that they're having might be good judgment on their part. They might be being offered terrible sex, and them not liking it probably isn't a problem. It might be their wisdom. This might be good judgment. It might be like, yes, most people wouldn't want that, or yes, that's not aligned with your pleasure template. Yes, you feel lonely in sex, feel like your partner doesn't know who you are, what you like. That's not a desire problem. That's a quality of sex problem. And so I'll spend time talking with clients and saying, let's talk about not liking sex versus not liking the sex you're having. And for a lot of people, if they don't have a range of past experience, that's a new idea for them to think about. They might not have anything to compare it to.
Yeah.
To be able to say, I don't like food would be an interesting statement from somebody. So you'd start to say, well, what kinds of food have you tried?
Yes, absolutely. And each part of the food process, right, is the change. There can be change with age, taste, spices, things along those lines of just what you like and what you don't like. I like that comparison. I did think of that while reading the book, wondering, well, for those that don't have a lot of experience, say, I believe you and I work with a lot of individuals that have had very minimal sexual experiences.
Mhm.
Oftentimes before a long-term committed relationship such as marriage or deciding to be with someone for a long period of time. And it's really hard to go back to, well, you don't know what you don't know, kind of like what you were saying.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so if sex has always been one way or a couple different ways, and on top of that, the education that you've received is almost nil, um,
Mhm.
pertaining to female sexual pleasure, male sexual pleasure, really for anybody, because for male bodied individuals, it's oftentimes like, well, pretty straightforward. This is what you do. And not everyone gets that type of information. And for female body individuals, it's a lot harder to even identify what feels good and in what manner, and not a lot of education around that. And so oftentimes it can seem like, well, sex is just something that you do. It's pretty straightforward. And then if it's not very fun, you don't have much of a desire for it, it becomes a chore. And like we start a cycle that is really, really problematic that you may not even know you've started a cycle to, or that you've been in a cycle for. And then a sex therapist comes along and says, hey, well, what is good sex? What would be pleasurable for you? And it's like, I don't know.
No
I've
idea.
never even masturbated.
Yeah, no idea. Yeah, I think culturally it's difficult stereotypically for females to be friends with their body growing up. And you really do have to be friends with your body and being able to envision it as a vehicle for pleasure rather than an instrument to poke, prod, deprive, criticize, And so if the sex you're having is boring or unpleasant or stressful or not enjoyable, it is good judgment on your part that you don't like it. So, low desire can be a completely rational, reasonable, appropriate response for your mind and body to say, I don't like this sex. I don't want to do it.
Mhm.
So, there are times when low sexual desire is not a dysfunction, it's a good function. It's wise on your part. This is your body saying, not like this. And so when we're always talking about low desire as a sexual dysfunction, there are a lot of times when you are functioning correctly. I would be very concerned about you if you loved having a terrible time in bed.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you state it like that, it makes so much sense too. Of the um, if it's something that you don't like, why do you then have to focus on trying to like it? It just
Mhm.
we've got to alter something. We've got to
Mhm.
alter it. I think of one thing I just recently learned when we were going back to food is my dad growing up, he would always whisk together eggs and tuna and make tuna fritters. But up
Oh,
until like 2 weeks ago, I didn't recognize he didn't put salt. He just put some pepper on it. So he'd feed it to us, and I was like, ooh,
I don't like this, Dad.
I don't know. I mean, it was like it was all right, but it wasn't like I started making some and I started putting spices and some spinach and some other things into it. I'm like, this is freaking amazing.
Mm.
But I had to start putting things in like garlic and chipotle and some other things that I really, really enjoy. And I sent him an image of it. He's like, wow, it looks like you do a lot more to that. I'm like, and it tastes super good. He's like, oh, I'm a pepper guy. I don't even put salt in it. I'm like, you didn't put salt in the eggs.
Eggs need a lot of salt, Dad.
Yes. So I think that's exactly what you're describing too, of like, if I were to just to be like, well, this is just how tuna and eggs go together and I hate it or I don't like it, or it's okay, but I could go without it. I went without it for years, and if I don't ever have tuna fritters again, I wouldn't mind it.
Hey,
That is a switch where it's like, okay, well, what's the chipotle? What do you start bringing in? And when I'm talking spice, I'm not necessarily talking about spice up your sex life with the new positions and things. They often refer to Cosmopolitan and male magazines and things like that, about
so
the
much,
things you're
so
supposed
much
to do, right?
bad education coming from those sources. Yeah. And yeah, so this was like the first key point that rose out of their interviews with people who had magnificent sex is they realized, oh, these people know the difference between good sex and bad sex. They know themselves really well and can advocate for the kind of sex that they enjoy, and their partner cares about their unique tastes and differences. Their partner cares about learning about what works for them instead of saying, well, most people like this, you should too. That wasn't a dynamic in these magnificent lovers that they interviewed in this research.
Absolutely. In fact, I want to say that most of it was, and we'll get to some of those other key points too, but a lot of that typically turned out to be a willingness to explore, to be vulnerable, to off the top of my head, there's a couple others that they kept coming back to, but those are the ones that the exploration, the vulnerability, and kind of the willingness to just allow things to grow and progress, that it wasn't this rote or specific space to have to be in. And that was extremely powerful and something they found with most of the magnificent sex individuals they were interviewing.
Yeah, and it lined up with my clinical experience of when I'll often have a female-bodied individual come and say, I have low desire, and basically I'm the identified patient. My partner is like, hey, go get help and come back to me when you're fixed. And that is part of the problem, to realize that, no, this is something that the two of you explore and figure out. And maybe you do the work first to be the expert of yourself. But her low desire may have nothing to do with her being dysfunctional. That has to be a possibility on the table.
Absolutely.
It may not be a dysfunction. It may be her operating correctly under the given circumstances.
Yeah, that it doesn't fall back into that dysfunction. I also like that we talked about, or that they were talking about, there's the low desire, there is the premature ejaculation, delayed ejaculation, anorgasmia, erectile dysfunction, and yeah, just that if you're not acting or doing what is supposed to be done, then all of a sudden you've got this problem that needs to be fixed. And if you can't be fixed, say bye to sex. And that's just not the case. It's just not the case. There's so much flow that you can go towards in your sexual expression that having sex is not, I think they said a couple of times, insert A into tab B, or insert tab A into,
that a few times in the book. Yeah. It's funny.
There's so much more to it. There's so much more. And a dysfunction is not a death sentence to your sexual expression or your sex life.
Yeah, and they made the inverse true. I think the last paragraph of this section, she said she was trying to clear up this idea so that low desire may not be a sexual dysfunction, but also people who are functioning properly, that doesn't guarantee great sex. There's more to it. So great sex isn't the absence of dysfunction and the presence of function. There are people who function properly and are not having great sex. And there are people who function dysfunctionally and are having great sex. And so it kind of tweaks our goal from, for sex therapists, which is, let's treat the dysfunction that we see in the DSM and then they'll have great sex. And she's like, no. People are having great sex with with dysfunction, and people are having terrible sex with proper function. I hope I'm being clear. I'm not sure how articulate I'm being.
No, what I'm hearing you say in particular, it's making sense to me as I've read the book. But for listeners that may be like, wait, what do you mean dysfunction with not? The only thing I could think of is that when we are, or from what you're stating, is that just because you have a vulva that gets wet, just because you have a penis that gets erect, just because you can last for as long as you want to, or the ways that that you'd like to be touched, or you can have sex, does not guarantee that you will eventually work your way into magnificent sex or even great sex. You can have lousy sex that way. And just because your penis doesn't get hard, or because you have some differences, they've even talked about individuals in there that experience nerve damage, or that didn't have body parts. Yeah, just disabled body, or disabled experience versus, or an alternative ability, that didn't condemn someone to bad sex. In fact, those individuals seem to be having great sex or magnificent sex because of the communication and the necessity to say, this is what I want to experience, this is what I can experience, this is what feels good, versus the societal norm of, this is what I'm supposed to do, this is how long I'm supposed to last, this is what I'm supposed to engage in, and anything else I don't have a say in. And that seemed to be a huge change there.
Yeah. So that was, her first key idea from this research, is that we can increase our desire by having better sex.
Yes. Yes.
Do you feel good about moving on to?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think that sounds great. So if we're over on key idea 2, during magnificent sex, lovers are focused, connected, and vulnerable. So there was a precursor to that a little bit earlier. But when I think of the people that were identifying being focused, connected, and vulnerable, there was one story that stood out to me in particular about being focused. And I want to say it was this, I swear I had heard this experience from somewhere else too, but maybe it's the research that I'd been reading earlier. But this individual,
books too.
What?
So maybe she's written a few books, so maybe
probably. It was the older individual that where they would cut up cheeses and carbs and proteins, and they're like, we have sex once a week, but that sex lasts for 3 days. I was like, whoa. That's quite this escapade. They're focused. They were focused and vulnerable and identifying what they want to experience, and they would go into a sexual experience. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there was the missionary position and that lasted for 3 days. It was a sexual experience and involved like possibly disrobing or talking or laughing, or they were obviously making their meals because they didn't want to stop the sexual experience to go and make food.
Yeah.
So it was
intentional. And if I remember in that story, these were older individuals who'd made peace with some of their dysfunction, actually. And the man, he's like, I can't have sex 3 times a week anymore. Just my refractory period, my blood pressure, And so they'd said, that's fine. We'll have a day of pleasure and connection. And we'll adjust to these changing realities. And it was still magnificent for them, but they were intentional about it. And in this, second key idea, what rose up was that people who have magnificent sex describe the experience. Some used the word transcendent, some used the word flow, some used the word absorbed, with this idea that nothing else mattered other than what they were doing right then. That the time, the clock stopped, the outside world slowed, and all that mattered was what the ways that the two of you were connecting at that moment. It's a very Zen idea. I think it's very much of an Eastern idea. I think for probably Western Americans particularly, we have to work harder at this skill of flow and focus and being consumed in a moment. I know it's difficult for me. So I'm like, is that my Americanness? Is that my femaleness? Is that my ADHD brain? Is that what is that about me? But it is harder to learn to be in that state of flow and letting everything else drop off and being absorbed in a moment. But that was the key number 2 thing that these magnificent lovers had figured out how to do together.
Yeah. Yes, they had. The other, when we're talking about this flow, I go to the distractions. I think of, and I think you're alluding to that as the distractions. So many distractions happen when it comes to where your mind can go. I would say that happens in the office when I'm working with couples or individuals so often that laundry, things that need to be done, where kids need to go, what your body parts look like, if you're doing things right, if you need to be thinner, bigger, smaller, if you should be acting a certain way, more orgasmic, less orgasmic. The mind starts taking over.
Yeah, their anxious mind was not a part of magnificent sex.
At all. At all.
Yeah.
So here's a question I wanted to ask you, Cami. So they talked about mindfulness, but not necessarily mindfulness in meditation there's a certain component to it, but they said mindfulness was different than sitting with Zen or even being a part of the experience as it unfolds. It was a different of being moment to moment, kind of like you were describing. I'm curious, how did you conceptualize or keep in your mind what they were talking about mindfulness in sex without it being mindfulness or meditation?
Yeah, because I was working on that because we love Lori Brodo and we love her book Better Sex with Mindfulness.
Yes.
And what I think Kleinplatz was getting at is that it's similar to that, but not the same, because if we're meditating and we're mindful, it's completely internal. We're not interacting with another person. But sex as this flow or mindfulness means that our mind is calm, but at the same time attuned to another. So it's not this lonely, disconnected experience. When I meditate, I'm disconnected from others. I'm disconnected from the world. I'm going completely internal. Well, that would be a shitty, I'm sorry, I don't know if we swear on this podcast or not, but that wouldn't be a great sexual experience if both partners were completely internal and not attuned to each other. So it was a little more complex than just meditating. It was the ability to have a calm mind in the moment and also be attuned to your partner, where I'm not feeling anxious about how I feel, but I'm also not anxious about how you feel. There's the calm mind, but also the attunement. And I think that's how I interpreted how she was trying to make this different than just mindfulness. How did you interpret how it was different than just mindfulness?
I think similar to what you were talking about, mindfulness being internal or recognizing right now I can hear my computer going and making those sounds. And I'm not making judgments about it. So I guess I need to look in three components. First one is meditation. I think mindfulness and meditation get intertwined so often. So I wondered if they were talking about that as well. Is that meditation can be this sit, you can go somewhere, you can stay here, you can see, you can observe, you're just experiencing life, which is wonderful, but you're not necessarily acting on it. I view meditation as something along those lines. That's a method to be able to relax yourself. Mindfulness is something you and I can do right now. In fact, our listeners can do that at this point in time. What does it feel like to sit in your seat? Can you hear things around you? Are there colors around the room? We're just recognizing what's happening, and we're withholding judgment of what's happening. Just we're noticing what's going on. The way that they were describing it seemed as though that you were losing yourself into the moment, which seemed to be a combination of how I view mindfulness and where they were talking about what someone does in magnificent sex, which is they were talking about, I don't know where I start and they, or where I end and they start. We are one, we're engaging in this. And I felt I was a part of me, and it just, my hand goes here and I just do that. I'm not like, should I go there? Is that what they want? That's the questioning and the judgment. But in a magnificent sexual experience, they were talking about being in a space where you could just flow and feel like there was flow. And there wasn't that judgment. There was just noticing, I would like this. And so I'm going to move their hand here, or I'm going to ask for this, or I'm going to engage in this way. And that seemed to be mindful in the sense of there wasn't this, ooh, if I ask that, then, I mean, has she ever done this? Has he ever done that? Is that what they want? Do they not? It just is kind of getting in the moment and allowing yourself to be vulnerable. And I thought of, I can't remember where I heard this. I want to say Kristen Hodson said it at one point in time, which is like, really vulnerable sex is kind of leaving yourself at the end of going like, whoa, did I just say and do those things? And that seems to be that mindful space of, this is something I'd like to experience. And so we can just engage in it in a consensual manner, without that judgment, and just allowing yourself to be you.
And she talked about, some couples talk about in the book or in her research about how lonely it was to not be in that state of flow together. That magnificent lovers enter that space together. That I think there was one woman who talked about the loneliness of seeing the partner be like at a level 10 aroused, and they were like, you left me behind.
Yeah.
And so that, that attunement together and the state of flow together. The one thing I like about this book, we often assume like cis heteronormative monogamous individuals are the basis of this research, and it often is. But her research was not. So she was including in this, hey, non-consensual non-monogamous couples and kinky couples and queer couples. These key ideas were the same for them as well as for, cis hetero individuals. So I did want to plug that too, that lest this come off as a very exclusive book, it was very inclusive in her research and the way she wrote it.
Absolutely. And I liked the stories and the experiences often included the forms of plurals. Like, how would you know someone's having great sex? Well, I'd walk up to them, and that was one that was even jarring. Like, I work with LGBT populations, but I'm so used to the dyad oftentimes that when they're like, well, I noticed that and I was like, oh yeah, very much in poly group, multiple sex partners in this experience too. So this is not just a heteronormative sexual book that they were just researching. So I'm glad you brought that up too. That's an important part there.
Yeah, their research was really inclusive. So when we talk about being in flow with another, people who had one night stands that were magnificent explained that phenomenon also, that they were in flow and attuned. And
I also really like that. That's why I like that insert tab A into slot B. That is such a misconception with, in particular, gay males. That is like, oh, well, if you're gay, then you have anal sex, and that's not. It's not the case. That there are tons of desires in different ways and different methods. Again, we're not talking about where a penis goes. We are moving away from that.
Moving away. Well, key idea 3 was my favorite.
Tell me about it.
Actually, I don't know what your favorite was. Key idea 3 was my favorite. And that idea was that age is not an obstacle, it's an advantage. And so I loved it because so many of my clients have this fantasy that if they had more sex when they were young, then they missed out, basically. They missed out on great sex because they weren't having lots of sex when they were young, basically. And she talked about the idea that age, most of the people interviewed said that their most magnificent sexual experiences started to happen when their 30s and their 40s. And I was like, yes, that's so normalizing. I love this. Thank you. That when they think about their most magnificent sexual experiences, it wasn't in their 20s or their teens. And they started to value, me knowing myself, me growing up a little bit, me learning how to communicate, these all added to a good sexual experience. And that's a fantasy I combat a lot in couples therapy, who might have regrets about maybe a purity culture they were raised in, or just mourning their youth. And this gave me some fantastic ways to combat that fantasy because it doesn't line up with her research. The
Absolutely.
Best sexual experiences were happening in their 30s and their 40s. And they said that happened because they knew themselves better. They were less judgmental of themselves. They'd learned communication skills they didn't have. And it's just blowing that Cosmo men's health idea out of the water that sex is for the fit and flexible and the young. Yes. She's saying, nope, she just the research has destroyed that fantasy. And I loved it, that age was not an obstacle. It was seen as an advantage, their age, their experience, their human development. Even with the dysfunctions that come with age, it wasn't an obstacle.
Yeah, those challenges that come with age, it gives another space to be explorative, creative. Oh, that was another word I wish I'd said earlier. Creativity. Let's get creative. And I'm 100% before this book. I grew up in more purity culture, followed the purity culture. And there's been times I've had to do my own work when it comes to the grief of feeling, didn't get to know what it was like to be a sexual teenager, didn't know what it's like to be this, or to not experience a bunch of shame around any sexual expression that was there. And then listening to this, I was like, you're right. I could have sex when I was a teenager, but they were talking
How
about the
would have been good.
Could you have done this with this body part? Yes. How amazing would that have been?
Not
Probably not great. Possibly exciting for the newness and other things like that. But there was one part in there that they said that there was a lot of sex therapists that were getting it wrong and thinking that, like, well, you can't always have it the way that, you know, it was when you're at the very beginning of your relationship or in your teenagers, because everything's novel. And it's like, whoa, I've heard plenty of times that, like, hand jobs or oral sex, or even engage in whatever sexual experience you want to have, is that there is a newness, but oftentimes the newness doesn't come with communication, doesn't come with vulnerability. It's kind of like, well, what does this partner want and what do I want? Sometimes it's like, I'm here to get mine. Let's race to see who gets theirs first. That's not good sex. That is not good sex. So that I love that aspect too, where it's like, as getting older, people had less what's that word? Had less they were less likely to participate in essentially lousy sex because they weren't willing to sit there and go, well, I guess this is what it's going to be, which oftentimes younger individuals and newer relationships will do, versus like, no, this may be not a great experience, but I'm learning from it. And I also am going to vocalize what I want and what I don't want, and not do what I don't want to do. And I was like, that is really cool, especially looking forward to later on in age. And even my experience with growing with my partner has been, it's only gotten better the more vulnerable and the more engaged both partners have become.
Yeah. So I loved that part of the book. That part of the research was really exciting to me.
Yeah, I think that's great. So in key idea number 5, we're getting to my favorite one. I think the 6 is my favorite. Huh?
4.
Oh, geez, we're only on 3. Okay. Yeah, 4. Thank you. I totally skipped a part. Extraordinary lovers tend to be open, curious, and self-accepting. Ooh, the self-acceptance one was where I got caught. How do we encourage self-acceptance, and how does someone even get to self-acceptance? Do you remember some of the thoughts that people had, or do you have any thoughts on how someone works towards self-acceptance? Because that's easier said than done.
Yeah, it makes me sad and angry. I have a lot of systems I blame that have made it difficult for humans to be self-accepting. And that's, I think, a lot of the work that happens in our 30s and 40s. I know there's tons of internalized shame and a lack of pride in our 20s. I don't want to say that, I don't want to ignore that. That's completely there. But a major thing I work with my clients is coming to a accepting one. Body image is a huge one, but also then accepting that they're a sexual being. There can be a lot of shame around what people enjoy or find pleasurable. And so self-acceptance, whether we're talking about having the relationship you want with pornography, or having the relationship with your body that you want, or having the relationship with your own sexual template, there's a lot of systems I blame that make that difficult for us. But I think that is probably a universal job we all have to do, is work through becoming accepting of our body and our sexual selves. I think that's fairly universal work. We don't all choose to do it, but if we were going to be a magnificent lover, we need to choose to do it.
Absolutely. Some of the thoughts that I had from that, or at least what I remember within it, is letting go. And some of those individuals were letting go out of necessity, like there was a big life change that happened, or out of choice. And oftentimes I think the choice can be maybe harder in a certain extent, because usually when there's necessity, it's like, well, it's either this or nothing, versus, oh, I think that there's something different with my body, my feelings, my experience, who I am, and this acceptance. where we're in a world that is very open about what is acceptable and what's not. It's
Mhm.
becoming more and more acceptable, such as having internet rooms and groups where you can see there's other people experience what you experience too. Whereas beforehand, that was harder. But at this point in time, being able to be fluid and flexible and
Mhm.
change, have your willingness to continue learning, that seemed to be a huge part of the self-acceptance is I have this desire, I think. Can we explore? Can we not? We're not going to do this perfect the first time. And that involves everything such as like kissing, not being just if you enjoy kissing, allowing kissing being something that is an end to a sexual experience or
Mhm.
middle, or not just this beginning. Oftentimes in society, we show that there's kissing is just focused on the start. We start with a kiss, and then we move to this, and then we move to removing clothes, and then we move to this and this and this, cultivating all into this orgasm, and then sex is over.
Mhm.
And being able to accept yourself, I think one of the statements there was, "Great sex always changes, tolerating discomfort, and each one can press and manage their own discomfort." So each person gets to be discomfort or have discomfort, and then you get to explore what that discomfort looks like and what that experience is for you. And then you move into self acceptance. Wow, that is what I want. Oh, this is kind of difficult for me. I wonder why. But that it wasn't this push away of, I don't know what that is. I don't want to express it. It's got to be dead. Push it down, push it away. And if you can accept yourself for who you are, the actions you want, the fantasies you experience, be able to express those, that's true safety, self acceptance, and really leads you to magnificent sex.
Yeah, and I don't know if we should be surprised about this because when we talk about mental health and emotional health, it's always, top characteristics are mental rigidity. And so if we're talking about trying to improve our sex lives, our sexual health, that mental rigidity is going to also make things difficult in this area of our lives. So being open and being curious is part of mental health resiliency and emotional resiliency, but here it's showing us it's also part of sexual resiliency that, oh, the erection didn't go how we wanted. That's fine. Let's stay open. Let's stay curious. How else could we have pleasure? Oops, I have a human need I need to go take care of for a minute. And they're staying open. They're staying curious. They're staying self accepting. They're not tied to a rigid script of what should or shouldn't happen. And that's true in every area of mental health that we talk about. And so, of course, it's also here in sexual health as this key principle of magnificent lovers are open, they're curious, they're accepting, they're flexible, they're not rigid with what should happen.
Absolutely. And that plays into key number 5, which is the greatest skills or sexual skills are empathy and communication.
Mhm.
So empathy and communication within a relationship far exceed anything you could read on a magazine about mind-blowing sex tips or new positions or the newest toy or experience or novel thing that sure it could be fun and aid in your experience of what maybe you're interested in if you're interested. But the problem is it's meant to sell the magazine and sell you on the idea that there is something that you can do that will make it happen without communication of all the things. the, do this. If you know it, you can do it to your partner. They won't know. It'll blow their mind because they won't know. They won't see it coming. And you'll do this thing. And you're going to be this sex god or goddess. And
Yeah, that never came up in their research as what made magnificent sex,
no,
right?
never once did I hear page 52 on Cosmopolitan. The It blew our minds and we never had to talk about it. No.
Mm, mhm. Yeah, and that made me have some thoughts as I was, knew we were gonna have this discussion. I was like, yeah, we're talking about instead of being a sexual doing, a sexual being, meaning great sex is not do X, do Y, do Z. No, it's be open, be um, empathetic, be communicative. Um, it's be a sexual being instead of a sexual doing. There's no part of our anatomy sexually that operates like the knee, when someone gets out with those reflex tools and hits your knee and it moves. That is not how a penis or clitoris works. The biggest sex organ is our brain, and you have to be making love to the other person's mind just as much as you are their genitals for it to be magnificent.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. It's not about what you do or what gets to a physical response. It's all about, I love that, making love to their mind, not so much their body. Huge important thing there. And the empathy. So I thought, though, I like that they talked about the empathetic side of things being, well, how does someone provide empathy or give empathy? And the thought that I had beyond understanding or experiencing empathy in the bedroom is exploring that vulnerability. When someone is being vulnerable, asking, exploring, expressing who they are, that we sit back, witness, participate, and show up for that person in the way that you would want them to show up for you as well.
Yeah. Yeah, they talked a lot in these chapters about the role of trust. And the way I talk about it with the clients in my office is how to take someone seriously without taking them personally. And even one night stand couples that they interviewed said, I had enough trust that I knew we could have good sex just from meeting. That was interesting because most of us think, oh, you've got to have these multiple experiences in this long-term relationship to develop the kind of trust that's necessary. But I'll talk about it in terms of do I trust that my partner can take my feedback seriously without taking it personally? If I move their hand, will they be like, take it as a criticism of you don't do this right? Or will they be like, oh, that would work better for you. Thank you for telling me. That is empathetic communication in sex. Is I trust that my partner can give me feedback. And I'm happy to have that feedback because I want them to enjoy what we're doing. So yes, please give me feedback. I'm going to take it personally, but I'm not going to take it seriously. I'm not going to take offense. I'm not going to take it as criticism. I'm going to go, oh, I'm so glad I know you prefer my hand there. That is what I think an empathetic lover is.
I love that. We don't have to take it personal. If you're taking it personal, then that means that, again, there's the shame involved in that, right? I should know how to do it perfect. I should be able to, I'm requiring myself to be a great lover by knowing what my partners need, knowing how to do it perfectly. And that is a real rough tug of war that I see with my couples, or even in the thruples that I've worked with, is that if I have to know and do, that means the partner either needs to push against that and say, no, I don't like that, which puts this person in the wrong and that breaks their requirement. Oh, I should have known. Or it makes this person acquiesce and go, if this is the partner, if this is what they want to do, great. It creates this thing. I don't really like it, but that's just how our sex life goes. And I've seen fake orgasms come from that.
Oh,
I've
yes.
seen
Totally.
avoidance of sex, all
Yeah.
sorts of things to avoid this tug of war, when if we can take that ego out of it and go, oh, I thought you liked being touched like this. And for months, years, hours, moments, minutes, I thought that you liked this, but thank you so much for showing me. I'll do that.
Yeah. And in that same vein of sexual empathy, they talked about knowing who you're doing what for and taking turns maybe of that this touch is I get the most pleasure out of this, or you get the most pleasure out of that. And we're kind of keeping a balance of we both had a good time and maybe we have different favorite experiences, but we know our partner's favorite experiences and we're willing to bring them in. And so it was this idea of empathy, that there's something good in it for both of us, and we know what those components are, and we're willing to take turns and make sure it was mutually enjoyable.
Absolutely. And so then we get to the place that was one of my favorites, which is also, I think, one of the more difficult ones, was key point 6, which is magnificent sex. Magnificent sex just happens randomly, and that's not the case. It just doesn't work that way. You have to build to, you have to work towards. If you want magnificent sex, you've got to put time and effort into it. It doesn't just happen.
No, and that's a myth I have to bust. And I don't know that I always bust it because it's so anchored into people's schemas and beliefs, is that
Yeah.
sex should be effortless. And they have this idea that natural is effortless. And my best analogy for that is asking if they've ever witnessed someone learn to breastfeed, or if they've ever learned to breastfeed, because it is the quote unquote most natural way of feeding a human. Not necessarily the best way, but that's a whole nother argument. But
Yeah.
it is natural, but it's often difficult. There's a period of trying to learn with the baby, and the baby, you have to train the tongue and you have to train your breast, and there's a period of learning before it's easy. And even though it's natural, so natural doesn't mean easy.
Mhm.
Sex being a natural human expression doesn't mean it's always an easy expression, but people put time into it and plan it, and that doesn't have to be unsexy. To know someone thought about something and thought about my preferences and made choices and plans for that, that's really romantic to me.
Yeah.
Instead of and so I loved point 6 because it challenges this myth that it should be spontaneous and passionate from out of nowhere. And most of the people she interviewed said their most magnificent experiences had a lot of effort put into it.
Yeah. And I think that my favorite point of this is exactly the same reason that you were talking about it, is that if you are in a place that you feel like everything needs to be done randomly, spontaneous, that becomes problematic so fast, because how often do we, unless you get into a pattern and a rhythm, which takes weeks and weeks, so we could go into atomic habits and the conversation there of how you get into patterns. And sex is something that gets, it's a livelihood. It's an experience that takes effort and changes with age, time, children, non-children, work, stress. It gets affected this way. And just the same as if someone wanting to improve their body movement, going to a gym, or deciding to do a workout at home, or deciding to go for a walk, it all requires you to carve out time from your day. And we
Mhm.
all have parts of our life that require and demand our time. That means that if you don't plan for it and you don't fight for that time, it will not be awarded to you. I see far too often that sex is reserved for 10 p.m., 11 p.m., the last experience of the day right before bed. So it is constantly fought between how tired am I from a long, busy day, and how much do I want sex? And oftentimes sleep wins out, or it's passive sex. And it's not great or even magnificent sex, because it's like, well, hopefully we get to bed in a time that works for our energy. And that, if we're waiting for it, it doesn't work that way. But then the people I talk with about carving it out in the morning or in the midday, work, school, carpool, other things get taken into like, well, I can't take time away from that. It's like, well, we need to figure out a way to do this. And it may take resources, money, time. But if you're looking for magnificent sex and not just something that's like,
Yeah,
then
no one's interviewed said it just happened on its own. People
no.
who said, that they were magnificent lovers or experienced magnificent love, that was a key component from all of them, is they put in effort to make sure that there was the time available and the energy available for it to be magnificent. It was never just something that happened.
No. And that's what made it one of my favorite key points, because that's even something that I would say not just clients that I work with, but everybody, myself included. You've got
Mhm.
to keep reassessing how you're showing up and when you're showing up, and what your expectations are. Have you communicated those expectations? Have you identified what you're hoping for, what you're wanting for? And are you just hoping they happen and that your partner knows?
Yeah.
Because if that's the case, you're setting yourself up for a really, really difficult feeling of, wow, I'm not getting the sex that I was hoping for or wanting. And I sure hope that it happens and it doesn't just randomly fall out of the sky. And sometimes it will, but this is few and far between. That is the exception and not the rule.
Yeah. I really love this book because it was descriptive research. It was let's find out the commonalities that people who our magnificent lovers share.
Yeah.
And so it was really descriptive, really explorative. There's for every reason, it won the 2021 Star Book of the Year, which is the Society for Sex Therapy Research. So in 2021, she won that award, and they both deserved it. I don't know. What do you rate it? Are you at that point, or are there still
Yes.
some things you want to?
No, I'm at that point. There's so much we could talk about within the book, but within the time frame that we've got, as well as if you really want to know more about it, you're like, what are these guys talking about? Read the book, or if you have read the book, send us a comment. Let us know if there were some things key points that you feel like we missed, or that you would like to reiterate, because we love hearing what your experience is with it too. But I would say that for the time being, we've sufficiently covered a lot of the key points here and the important aspects of it. Now, if we're going to go, I can never remember. Do we rate it out of 5 or 10?
I don't know.
I don't either. That's one of my favorite parts of Sexy Book Club, is we'll just switch between the two of them.
You give it a rating, but the system is incredibly loose.
I will say that the rating out of this book for me would be 4.5. I go 4.5. In particular, the thing I like about it is that I think it's important for sex therapists to read. And I would say that this is something that is probably making it to one of my top books to recommend for couples. I think that it's maybe a next step in a lot of ways, because I love that it gives examples. I love that it's talking from the interviewees. I love the way that they've set up their research. So I think it's a very, very valuable book to have. The hard part is saying, if a couple is coming in and they can't talk about sex, it's really hard to then give this book and say, hey, start reading about magnificent sex, where it's got really great components. Sometimes I think at that level, Come As You Are might be more supportive in that very beginning of like, what are the parts, but it's got to have some assessment. But if you were inclined to be like, hey, I think that I'm not getting the sex that I would like, or I think it's great, but I want to go magnificent, this is absolutely a book to read for you.
Yeah, I'm going to give it 4.5 out of 5 also. The criticisms I read from some reviews were that the first third felt too academic. Mm-hmm. For me, that's a plus, because I've got a little bit of a nerd in my brain, and I want to make sure that what I'm interpreting is based on best practices of research, and that these were validated. And I'm not a fan of I like people to bring their receipts when they say something. So she does that. She said, I'm saying these are keys of magnificent sex, and here's why. It is not an idea I came up with. This is represented here, and this is sound research. And so my nerd brain loves her explaining why the research is sound. So the first third, if you don't like that, you may just skim the research part and then get to the lessons that were learned. But as far as challenging myths couples walk into my office with, this is going to be a top recommendation when they have this idea about sexual health that is just unrealistic, problematic, not grounded in reality. I'm going to be like, let's start here.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite chapters, was that challenging the myths. What are they? How do you see them? And what's the reality to it? So great. We got 4.5 out of 5 for both of us. One of our first lives in the books, which is real exciting.
I know, we had like 3 viewers for a while.
You know what? And I love that we've been able to like practice some of these things and kind of see what comes up. I wanted to identify and explore just here towards the end. Like, this is our logo. Keep looking for this logo as you follow Sexplorers and Birds and Beasts podcast, as well as Sex Therapy 101. Between Cami and I, there's a plethora of information for sexual health. If you have questions, please email us, Sexplorers. Oh shoot, what's our Gmail? Sexplorers podcast at gmail.com.
Yeah.
Sexplorers podcast at gmail.com. We aim to, in one of these weeks, I think it's our 3rd or 4th week, we are going to do a Q&A. So these questions we compile, we put them together, and we're going to answer these questions, your questions, in one of these live segments when we go through these seasons. So definitely want to have this be a part of where we're reaching out to you and you get to reach back out to us. But stay tuned for even more information next week. We're going to be doing more of a dive into sexploring and how to explore a little bit more if you're interested in doing that. And you're going to hear more from me and then more from Cami. So we're excited to hear what you think about our setups for these seasons, and we're excited to explore with you. Any words from you, Cami?
Just like and share. The success of this show, we are trying to reach as many people as possible, which is hard when you're a therapist. You can only help the person on your couch. And Braxton and I are both passionate about trying to move the needle of the entire culture, not just help the one person on our couch. So if you like and follow, that's going to help us get this information to your friends and family and children and to the community, so we can increase the sexual competency of our communities. And if you value that, we're making this a free offering, but we're hoping with YouTube Live that then you have the opportunity to send us super chats and to support us financially, so we can keep protecting this hour to join with you.
Absolutely. Very well said. Very well said. And there's going to be more that comes up too with webinars we offer and things like that. But yeah, until next week, thank you for being on this journey with us and exploring with us.
Exploring with us.
You're going to need to find a fun tag to throw in there. This is so fun to just be like,
send us some tags. Tell us what.
Yes, tell us what tags to put on here, because a good punchline. Oh my gosh. Good end to that. But thank you again for being with us. Cami, thanks so much. Always great talking with you about these books.
Yes. All right. Until next time, Sexplorers.
We'll see you then.
Bye-bye.